It was meant to be a lightning-fast strike, a march into the Soviet Union that would break the enemy before they had time to react. But as the German Wehrmacht moved further into Russia in the brutal winter of 1941, they quickly realized they were not prepared for what lay ahead. The soldiers were freezing, hungry, and exhausted, and what had started as a swift invasion was turning into a deadly nightmare. For them, this would not be a war fought with tanks and guns alone, but one where the cold itself would become a merciless enemy. As the Germans advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the landscape turned hostile. Vast, frozen plains stretched in every direction, and temperatures plummeted far below freezing. The soldiers had been told that the Soviet Union would fall quickly, but the reality was far different. They had underestimated the power of the Russian winter, and soon they found themselves struggling just to stay alive. Inadequate clothing, poor supplies, and a lack of preparation for the extreme cold left them vulnerable. The woolen coats that were meant to protect them were not enough. Their boots, ill-suited for the snow, soon became soaked and frozen, their feet swelling and turning black. The men were desperate, barely able to move forward, and some began to wonder if they would ever see their homes again. This was the true cost of the invasion. The German soldiers had marched into Russia expecting victory and glory, but now many were just trying to survive. Their food rations were running low, and the frozen landscape offered nothing to hunt or forage. The army, which had once been unstoppable, was slowly being drained by the elements. Starvation and frostbite spread among the men, who huddled together for warmth, but even that was not enough. By December of 1941, the situation had grown even more dire. The Soviet forces, who had been pushed back at first, were beginning to regroup. As German forces pressed on, they faced fierce resistance from the Red Army, who were now fighting with everything they had. The German soldiers were caught between two merciless foes, the freezing cold and the unyielding Soviet defense. As they trudged through the snow, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were not just fighting for victory, but for survival. The grand strategy of Operation Barbarossa, once full of promise, now seemed hopeless. Every day was a battle. With each step forward, the soldiers grew weaker. The lack of food left them constantly hungry, their stomachs gnawing at them, while the cold drained their strength. The soldiers were becoming shadows of themselves, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. It was hard to tell if they were more afraid of the Soviets or the relentless winter. What they had once believed to be an unstoppable army was now faltering, and the war they had hoped would be over by Christmas was only just beginning. The Germans had underestimated the power of the Russian winter, and the consequences were becoming deadly. This was no longer just a war of conquest. It had become a war for survival. And as the soldiers huddled in the snow, facing an enemy they could not defeat, they realized that their march eastward had taken them into a place far darker and colder than they had ever imagined. By November 1941, the German soldiers had long since crossed the Soviet border and were deep in the heart of Russia. What they had hoped would be a swift victory had turned into a grueling nightmare. As they pushed forward, they not only faced the ever-present threat of Soviet forces, but also the relentless cold that seemed determined to destroy them. The harsh Russian winter, which they had underestimated, was now taking its toll. With each passing day, the temperatures plummeted lower, and the soldiers were ill-prepared to handle what nature was throwing at them. The German uniforms, designed for a European winter, were useless against the severe cold of the Russian front. Many of the soldiers wore thin coats that offered little protection from the freezing winds. Their boots, once sturdy, now became traps, quickly filling with snow, soaking their feet and freezing them in a matter of hours. In a place where survival meant keeping your body moving, frostbite became a constant threat. The soldiers struggled to maintain their warmth, but even the act of walking felt like a battle. Their bodies grew numb, and it became harder to tell if they were shivering from the cold or simply from exhaustion. Food, too, was running low. The rations were scarce, and what little they had often froze before they could eat it. Soldiers tried to melt snow to drink, but it was never enough to quench their thirst, and it did nothing to warm them. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the cold became a constant companion, one that gnawed at them relentlessly. But the soldiers knew they had to press on. They had been told that they were on the brink of victory, that the Soviet Union would soon be broken. But as the snow fell harder and the winds howled louder, the truth of their situation began to sink in. Each day brought new hardships. The soldiers had to continue their advance despite the suffering. With each step, they grew weaker, and their morale began to slip away. The promise of quick victory had vanished, replaced by the harsh reality of a war they couldn't escape. Many began to wonder if they would ever see home again, if they would survive the winter, or if they would fall to the brutal Soviet defense. The Soviet army, which had once been pushed back, was now fighting back with everything they had. As the German soldiers battled their way through the snow-covered landscape, they found themselves constantly harassed by the cold, which seemed to drain their very will to fight. The more they pushed forward, the further they were from the warmth they had once known. The front lines were now frozen, and the soldiers realized that the fight was no longer just against the Soviets, but against the freezing temperatures that felt like a living force. The endless stretch of snow, the bitter wind, and the constant fatigue created a sense of hopelessness, and the once proud Wehrmacht began to falter. By the end of November, they had reached a breaking point. Some soldiers dropped from exhaustion, others fell to the cold, and many struggled to hold onto the last shred of hope. The frozen front had become a battlefield of a different kind, one where the elements were just as dangerous as the enemy. What was supposed to be a swift victory had turned into a battle for survival, and the German soldiers knew they were only beginning to face the worst of it. The snow-covered fields of Russia had turned into a white desert, endless and unforgiving. By December of 1941, the German soldiers were no longer marching with pride, but stumbling forward like ghosts, hollow-eyed and weak. Their food was nearly gone, their water frozen, and their bodies wasting away. What little rations they had left were shared in silence, each man breaking his portion into tiny pieces, trying to fool his body into thinking it was enough. Hunger had become their constant companion, whispering in their ears louder than any command or gunfire. At the start of the campaign, supplies had seemed abundant. Each soldier carried canned meat, bread, and coffee, believing the war would end before winter. But as the weeks turned into months, the long supply lines from Germany began to fail. Trains carrying food and fuel were stopped by snow, sabotaged by Soviet partisans, or lost entirely. The soldiers began to starve slowly, the same way they froze, one long hour after another. The bread that reached them was hard as stone, and the meat, when it arrived at all, was grey and tasteless. Some units went days without eating. The hunger twisted the men's minds. They spoke less, conserving their strength. Their thoughts focused only on food. They dreamed of warm meals, of soup, of home. Some tried to chew on frozen potatoes they dug from abandoned fields. Others boiled strips of leather from their gear, softening them into something they could swallow. When the horses that pulled supply wagons began to die in the cold, their bodies did not go to waste. The soldiers carved thin slices from the frozen flesh, cooking them over tiny fires, pretending not to think about what they were eating. Hunger had erased shame. Water became just as difficult to find. Rivers and wells were frozen solid. and the snow they melted barely kept them alive. Some men became sick from drinking too quickly, their empty stomachs unable to handle even water. Others drank from muddy puddles near their trenches, not caring what floated in them. The cold made even this a struggle. Ice clung to their eyelashes, their lips cracked and bled, and the pain of swallowing was as sharp as a knife. Still, they forced it down because thirst was worse than the cold. As the days dragged on, the soldiers' bodies began to fail. Their cheeks sank in, their ribs pressed against their skin, and their strength vanished. Carrying a rifle felt like lifting a tree. Some collapsed in the snow and never got up again. The rest kept moving, driven only by the instinct to survive. They scavenged through abandoned villages, breaking into barns and cellars, searching for anything edible. Sometimes they found frozen vegetables or bits of grain, other times nothing but empty shelves and silence. Every night, as the wind howled outside their shelters, the men lay awake, their stomachs burning, their thoughts heavy with despair. They no longer spoke of victory. They spoke only of food, of warmth, of when the suffering might end. The frozen land offered them nothing, and their commanders had no answers. For the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, hunger had become the enemy, and it was winning. By the first days of January 1942, the soldiers of the German army were no longer fighting a war of conquest. They were fighting a war against the cold, the hunger, and the slow collapse of their own bodies. The snow that once looked beautiful from a distance had become a white curse that stretched endlessly around them. Their hands were cracked and swollen, their lips split open, and their breath hung in the air like smoke from dying fires. The sound of gunfire was now distant, drowned out by the groans of men too weak to stand. They had nothing left but their will to live, and even that was fading. Water was the first thing they ran out of. The streams and wells had long frozen solid, and the snow was their only source of relief. The soldiers filled their helmets with snow, holding them close to the fire until it melted into a thin, dirty liquid. They drank it greedily, ignoring the metallic taste. Some scooped snow straight into their mouths, desperate for moisture, even though it made their throats ache from the cold. The more they drank, the more their stomachs cramped. The body could not handle the cold water, but thirst was stronger than reason. The hunger was worse. Rations had disappeared weeks ago, and the soldiers' bodies were beginning to consume themselves. Their faces were hollow, their uniforms hanging loose on their bones. Each day they searched the frozen ground for anything edible, but the land gave them nothing. The horses that had once pulled their wagons now lay dead in the snow, their bodies stiff and frozen. At first, the soldiers buried them, saying it was the proper thing to do. But after a few more days of starvation, they began to dig them back up. The first cuts were made in silence. A few men gathered around the carcass of a horse, hacking at the frozen flesh with knives and bayonets. They cooked the meat over small fires, the smoke curling upward into the dark sky. The smell of burnt fat filled the air, sickly sweet but irresistible. Others could not wait for it to cook. They tore the frozen strips with their teeth, too hungry to care. One man whispered that the blood, still frozen inside the body, could keep them alive longer if mixed with snow. It sounded insane, but desperation had already broken their sense of what was normal. They tried it, melting the blood with snow into a warm red drink. It was thick and foul, but it kept them from collapsing. Some soldiers pretended not to see what their comrades were doing. They turned away, ashamed and afraid of the weakness they felt. But hunger does not listen to pride. Within days, more men followed. They melted snow in their helmets, mixed it with blood, and drank it in silence, their faces pale and empty. For many, it was not about taste or strength anymore. It was about staying alive one more day, one more hour, one more breath. At night, The camp grew quiet, except for the sound of wind scraping across the snow. The men lay awake, staring at the canvas above them, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same pain. The war that had once promised glory was gone. Now it was only survival. They no longer feared the enemy beyond the hills. The real enemy was the cold inside their bones and the hunger eating away at their souls. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence it left behind was worse than the storm. The soldiers sat in their makeshift shelters, faces hollow, hands trembling as they cupped their helmets over tiny fires. The sound of melting snow dripping into metal was all that broke the stillness. By now, the men had accepted that water alone was not enough to keep them alive. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs like a living thing, and weakness blurred their thoughts. The strange mixture of blood and snow had become their grim salvation. It no longer shocked them. It had become part of survival. At first, only a few had dared to do it. They had whispered about it when others were not listening, afraid of being judged or punished. But as the days passed and the food vanished completely, the whispers turned into quiet acceptance. The blood of horses, and sometimes of the fallen, was melted with snow and sipped in silence. The mixture was thick and metallic, the smell strong enough to make some gag, yet those who drank it found a strange energy afterward, a flicker of warmth that pushed away the dizziness for a while. The body was desperate to survive, and so was the mind. One soldier later wrote in his notebook, "It is not the blood that makes you sick, it is the thought of it." He was right. After the first time, the fear disappeared. The taste no longer mattered. The mind began to numb itself, stripping away emotion until all that was left was the instinct to stay alive. Some soldiers joked bitterly that they were part of the snow now, their veins filled with frost and iron. Others refused to speak at all. They drank quickly, staring into the fire as if it could burn away what they were doing. The physical toll was brutal. Many were already weakened by frostbite and hunger, their skin pale and lips cracked. Some became feverish after drinking, shaking violently through the night. Others claimed to feel stronger for a few hours before collapsing again. It was not real nourishment, but the illusion of strength was enough to keep them moving. Their bodies were failing, but the will to live refused to break. They began to lose track of days, of battles, of the war itself. The front had frozen solid, and all that existed was the fight against death. In those frozen fields of Russia, humanity had started to fade. The soldiers did not look at each other the same way anymore. They avoided the eyes of their comrades, knowing they were all guilty of the same act. When they spoke, it was in short sentences, their voices dry and hollow. Some prayed quietly, asking forgiveness for what they had done. Others said nothing, believing that God had stopped listening long ago. The mixture of blood and snow became more than just a drink. It was a symbol of how far they had fallen, how far war had pushed them from the men they once were. At night, as the fires burned low, the men could still see the dark stains in the snow. They tried not to look, but their eyes always returned to it. The snow that had once been pure and white was now streaked with red, a silent reminder of what survival had cost them. It was no longer shocking, it was normal, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part of all. By February of 1942, the German soldiers trapped in the frozen wastelands of Russia had stopped counting the days. The war no longer felt like a campaign of strategy or purpose. It was simply survival, one moment to the next, one breath after another. The men were thin and ghostly, their faces hidden behind frost and filth, their minds worn down by endless hunger and cold. They no longer dreamed of victory. They dreamed only of warmth, of food, of sleep without shivering. Yet even in this ruin, they clung to something faint and stubborn, the will to keep going. They had done things they never believed they could. They had scavenged from the dead, burned their last letters from home for fuel, and drunk from the melted snow that carried the iron taste of blood. Some of them began to question what they had become. In quiet moments, when the fighting paused and the wind fell still, they wondered if they were still men or only animals trying to survive. One soldier whispered to another, "If my mother saw me now, she would not know me." His friend said nothing, just stared into the fire, watching the smoke twist upward into the darkness. But not everyone could afford reflection. Many of the soldiers had grown numb to everything around them. The cries of the wounded, the sight of frozen bodies buried under the snow, the smell of smoke and rot, none of it moved them anymore. Their minds had built a wall against the horror, because to feel was to fall apart. Some still clung to small rituals of normalcy. They polished their rifles, cleaned their boots, or recited prayers before sleeping. Others had stopped pretending, their eyes distant, their voices flat when they spoke. The war had hollowed them out from the inside, leaving only the shell of obedience. Letters from home arrived less and less often, and when they did, they were like messages from another world. One soldier read that his wife had given birth to a son. He smiled weakly, folded the letter carefully, and used it to light the fire that night. Hope was a luxury he could no longer carry. Yet in their hearts, many still believed that reinforcements would come, that trucks full of food and fuel would appear over the horizon. It was a hope they needed to survive, even if it was a lie. The Soviets were relentless. Their attacks came through snowstorms, their shells bursting like thunder over the frozen ground. The Germans fought back as best they could, though their fingers were too numb to pull triggers properly. Each man fought not for victory anymore, but for the man beside him, for the chance to see another sunrise. The price of survival was high, and it was paid in silence, in the slow erosion of conscience and soul. When night fell, the camp was filled with quiet whispers. Some prayed, some wept softly, some just stared into the dark. They had survived another day, but none of them could say what that survival was worth. For every life saved, something human inside them had been lost. And in the frozen stillness of the Eastern Front, even the strongest began to wonder if living through the winter would truly mean they had survived at all. The snow around the German camps was no longer white. It had turned grey, crusted with soot and frozen blood. The wounded lay in makeshift shelters, their breath shallow, their eyes half open, watching the frost creep across the canvas walls. The air was filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and the quiet rasp of men slipping in and out of consciousness. By March of 1942, there were no real medics left in most units, only soldiers doing what they could with what they had. The front lines had swallowed their doctors, and the cold had claimed the rest. Those who survived were left to care for themselves, surrounded by the dying. The wounded were the ones who suffered most. Frostbite blackened their fingers and toes, spreading up their limbs until amputation was the only choice. But there were no proper tools, no clean bandages, and no pain medicine. The men used knives heated in the fire to cut away dead flesh, biting down on rags to keep from screaming. The smell of burnt skin filled the air, mingling with the smoke and the stench of rot. The soldiers nearby tried not to watch, but in the small space of the shelter there was no escape. Every man could see the price of injury, could see what awaited him if he fell. At first, the wounded were treated with care. Their comrades tried to share what little food they had, wrapping them in extra blankets, talking softly to keep them awake. But as the days dragged on and the rations disappeared, kindness began to fade. Hunger does not allow compassion to live long. The wounded who could no longer move were left lying in the corners, wrapped in rags, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Their eyes followed the living, pleading silently for water or warmth, but the others could barely help themselves. One soldier whispered to another, "Better to die quickly than to freeze like that." No one disagreed. There were moments when desperation crossed the line into horror. When a wounded man died, his body was left where it fell until the ground thawed enough for a shallow grave. But sometimes, before that could happen, others came quietly at night. They took from the dead what they needed: a piece of uniform, a pair of boots, sometimes more. There are stories that some soldiers drank from the blood of their fallen, not out of cruelty, but because it was the only source of warmth and life left. Those who did it never spoke of it afterward. It was not something to confess, not even in whispers. The sight of death had become routine. The line between the living and the dead was blurred, their faces looking the same, pale and still. A wounded man might lie silent all night, and no one would realize he had died until morning. Others begged for a bullet to end their pain, and some received it, their comrades whispering prayers as they pulled the trigger. The war had stripped away the rules of mercy. By the time spring crept faintly over the horizon, the wounded were few because most had not survived the winter. The soldiers who remained were hardened and hollow, their hearts colder than the ice around them. They had watched too many die, and somewhere in the endless snow, their empathy had frozen too. What was once a brotherhood had become something else, something quieter and more terrible. A world where survival mattered more than kindness, and where every sunrise came at the cost of another man's last breath. By January of 1942, the German army that had once swept through Europe with unstoppable force was now trapped in the snow outside Moscow. The frozen fields stretched endlessly in every direction, and the men who had once marched with pride now stumbled through the ice like ghosts. Their rifles were rusted from the cold, their boots torn open, their fingers blackened by frostbite. The soldiers no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival, of warmth, of home. The great advance into the Soviet Union had ground to a halt, and the Wehrmacht was collapsing under the weight of the winter. The Soviet counter-offensive had begun with fury. Red Army soldiers poured out of the forests, their white camouflage blending with the snow, their movements swift and relentless. They knew the land, the cold, and the hardship. The Germans did not. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht had been told the Soviet Union would fall in a matter of weeks, that the Russian army was broken and weak. But as the temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below freezing, the Soviets fought harder than ever. Their tanks moved across the frozen ground, their artillery shells bursting through the icy air. The German lines were forced to retreat again and again, their strength fading with every step. The men were starving. The supply lines that stretched back to Germany had frozen along with the rivers and roads. Food and ammunition were lost in the snow, and the few supply trucks that made it through were ambushed by Soviet partisans. In the trenches, soldiers shared crumbs of bread that had turned solid from the cold. Canned meat, once a luxury, had long since disappeared. They melted snow for water, but even that was dangerous, as disease began to spread among the starving men. Their bodies were thin and weak, and their eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Some could no longer stand. Others simply sat down in the snow and never rose again. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. Fingers and toes turned black, spreading infection up their limbs. The smell of rot filled the camps. Medical supplies were gone, and the doctors, like everyone else, were freezing and starving. The soldiers wrapped rags around their feet and hands, but it was useless. The cold seeped through everything. They burned wood, paper, and even pieces of their own equipment to keep their fires alive. At night, the wind howled across the open plains, carrying with it the sound of moaning men too weak to move. Morale was gone. The soldiers had stopped saluting, stopped caring about rank or command. Their officers shouted orders that no one followed. Desertion became common, though there was nowhere to go. Some tried to walk west toward safety, but most froze to death on the road. The once proud divisions of the German army were now broken remnants, barely able to defend themselves. The Soviet forces pushed closer to Moscow, and the German front lines finally broke. Entire regiments vanished into the snow, wiped out by cold, hunger, and the relentless attacks. For the first time, Hitler's army faced the reality of defeat. The invincible Wehrmacht had met an enemy it could not conquer, an enemy that did not wear a uniform or carry a rifle. It was the Russian winter itself, and as the last of the German soldiers huddled in the snow, they realized the truth. The dream of victory had frozen long ago, buried beneath the ice, along with thousands of their fallen comrades. By the late winter of 1942, the men of the German army had stopped believing in the promises of their commanders. The dream of conquering the Soviet Union was gone, buried beneath the endless snow. The soldiers no longer talked about victory or medals. They talked about survival, about warmth, about food. Many no longer even spoke at all. Their bodies were broken, their spirits drained. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had marched east with confidence and thunder, was now a starving, shivering shadow of itself. The camps were filled with silence. The only sounds were coughing, the crackle of dying fires, and the wind tearing through the tents. The soldiers' faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. They moved slowly, their steps uncertain, their limbs wrapped in rags. Frost clung to their eyelashes, and the smell of sickness filled the air. The cold had made everything still. Even time seemed to have frozen, trapped in a grey world of snow and suffering. Illness spread like smoke. Men began to collapse without warning, their bodies unable to fight the infections that came from the filth and hunger. Frostbite had already taken fingers and toes, but now fevers burned through the ranks. Some soldiers coughed up blood, others fell asleep and never woke again. The medics had nothing left to treat them with. No bandages, no medicine, not even clean water. They did what they could, but their efforts felt meaningless. The wounded and sick were piled in corners of the shelters, their breaths shallow and weak, their eyes half open but unseeing. The cold showed no mercy. Temperatures dropped so low that weapons froze solid, oil in the guns turning to glue. Fires could not stay lit without fuel, and even when they did, the warmth never lasted long. The men huddled together, wrapping themselves in blankets that no longer offered comfort. They shared body heat the way they had once shared rations, but even that could not fight the chill that crept into their bones. Some stopped trying altogether. They sat quietly in the snow, staring into nothing, their minds slipping away. A few whispered prayers, others muttered the names of their families, their voices faint as wind. Letters from home had stopped coming, the mail lines had frozen, and most soldiers no longer expected word from Germany. Their homes felt like dreams, distant and unreachable. Some still carried small photographs tucked into their uniforms, but even those had begun to fade, the ink smudged by cold and time. Hope was a luxury none of them could afford. They lived hour to hour, day to day, waiting for something, anything, to end their suffering. Those who still had strength worked without thought, digging trenches in frozen ground, clearing snow from dead bodies, or repairing weapons that would soon freeze again. They followed orders out of habit, not belief. The war had stripped them of everything that made them human. The idea of going home felt like a story told to children, something that belonged to another life. As the weeks dragged on, the line between life and death grew thin. The soldiers no longer feared dying. For many, it seemed like the only escape left. The frozen forests around them were filled with the bodies of men who had simply given up. Their rifles lay beside them, their eyes open to the endless white sky. In the stillness, one truth settled over the survivors like the snow itself. The war was no longer about winning or losing. It was about enduring the unbearable, one frozen breath at a time, even when hope itself had already died. When the snow finally began to melt in the spring of 1942, the world that emerged beneath it was unrecognizable. The frozen corpses that had been buried under the drifts now thawed, their faces pale and empty, staring upward as if still waiting for orders that would never come. The German soldiers who survived the winter looked no better. They were thin, hollow-eyed, and silent, their uniforms hanging loose on their frail bodies. The retreat had begun, but it did not feel like escape. It felt like surrender to something far greater than defeat. The march westward was a slow procession of the broken. Thousands of men stumbled through the mud, their boots torn, their weapons dragging behind them. They passed the wreckage of tanks frozen in place, the remains of horses half buried in the ice, and villages that had been reduced to ashes. The air smelled of decay and smoke, a reminder of what the war had taken. For the soldiers who had endured the winter, there was no sense of victory or purpose. They had entered the East as conquerors and were leaving as survivors, unsure what that meant anymore. Every step was heavy with memory. The men remembered the faces of those who had fallen beside them, the cries of the wounded, the taste of blood mixed with snow. Some tried to forget, forcing the memories into silence, but others could not. At night, when the fires burned low, they stared into the flames and saw it all again. The frozen fields, the lifeless eyes, the hunger that had driven them to unspeakable things. One soldier whispered to another, "We are not the same men who left home." The other nodded, too tired to answer. They both knew it was true. The retreating columns reached the edge of the front, where warmer air carried the scent of spring. It should have been comforting, but instead it brought guilt. The men felt out of place in the sun, their bodies used to the cold. The warmth on their skin only reminded them of those who would never feel it again. Letters were written, but never sent. Words could not capture what had happened in the East. They could not explain what it meant to survive at such a cost. Back in Germany, the returning soldiers were welcomed as heroes by those who knew nothing of what they had endured. But behind every salute, behind every smile, there was silence. Many refused to speak about the winter campaign at all. They carried the memories alone, hidden beneath their uniforms and medals. Some tried to rebuild their lives, finding work, starting families, trying to forget the faces of the dead. Others were haunted by the ghosts of what they had done, the things they had eaten, the blood they had drunk, the men they had left behind. The war had ended for them in body, but not in mind. Years later, some of them would tell their children small parts of the story, leaving out the darkest truths. Others would say nothing at all. The silence between generations became its own kind of grave. For the survivors of the Eastern Front, the war never truly ended. It lived on in their dreams, in the cold that no fire could ever drive away. And as they grew old, one question followed them, quiet but relentless. Did they survive because they were strong, or because they had given up everything that made them human? The answer, like the snow that once covered Russia, never melted completely.